Hey, turn that thing up.
So we have these two great articles in the November-December 2023 issue of Faith Today magazine that form a kind of package about singleness in the church. And we were really excited to deal with this very important and sometimes overlooked topic. And so for me to have both our writers here is very exciting. So, Karissa, I want to start with you. In your beautiful essay, you wrote this line: "My life changed for the better when I stopped trying to get married." I would love to know, how did your life get better?
Yeah, wow. Um, I think it got better because I realized more hope. I think my hope for a lot of my life was in getting married, was in a human romance. And when I stopped striving for that, it just released me to be free and enjoy the life I actually had. So I think a lot of people think that wanting to get married and enjoying singleness are mutually exclusive. I don't think that they are. I still hold a desire that maybe that will happen for me, but it's not driving my life. It's not dictating every move. I'm not filtering all of my decisions through whether they result in marriage or romance for me or not. And that just takes so much pressure off. If your whole life goal is to be married or to find someone and you don't, then everything feels like a failure. And so removing that as like the ultimate milestone or the ultimate goalpost has just brought so much freedom to enjoy the life I have.
Oh, that's beautiful. You also talk about, and I think this plays into this a little bit, that the church didn't teach you how to be a person, it taught you to be a married person. And when I read that, and just thinking about you as a woman in, I think the evangelical subculture, I found myself wondering if there was actually more pressure or a different kind of experience for single women in the
Hmm.
church versus single
Hmm.
men. And so I wondered, Barry, if you
Hmm.
could comment on that and share maybe from your experience. Do you resonate with what Carissa is saying? And do you
Hmm.
think it's different for women and men?
I think there are some differences. Um, I recall in Carissa's article something along the line of waiting for Mr. Right to swoop down. And I thought, that is I think as a man, that would not have been my way to describe the search for marriage. I think as a man, often there still is some implicit expectation of men choosing and women being chosen. It's not. I think it's more. It's not as old fashioned as completely male versus female, but there still is some lingering expectation that men, the males will choose and the women will be chosen. I would say what is similar is there's typically a longing in most men to be married that often is accentuated for the physical aspect of marriage, which plays, I think, a large part of it. So I think for men, it would be sex, marriage, family, as a package. We definitely would be looking at it that way. At the same time, I think we often are similar to what Chris is describing in that we may be looking and it never comes. The right soulmate, the right partner never seems to really appear. And so there can be this sense of, God, what do you have for me in this?
Okay, very interesting. Go
I
ahead, Carissa.
Yeah, I'm noticing myself bristling. I do feel like there's this narrative of like For men, the physical part might be harder. And I think I want to be careful agreeing to that fully. I don't know what the male experience is, obviously, but I know a lot of women who struggle with the physical part too. And I don't want them to get erased in this conversation because I think, we're talking about the elephant in the room, which is celibacy, which is, I think, what sort of plagues this topic in a big way. And I think that's a challenge for women too. I also think the other thing that is a challenge for women is that men aren't told they don't have direct access to God, but women are told that all the time. Women are told that their access to God is through their husband. And so if you don't have a husband, well, what the heck does that mean for you? And so I do think there are some differences in experience that are just due to other theological issues that aren't maybe specifically about singleness.
Let me add to that with about the theology and that idea of access to God. The other theological thing I've heard sort of, I was going to say thrown out, but that's treating it too casually, but that marriage is a form of sanctification, that marriage sanctifies us. And I wondered how that lands for you as two single people, because obviously you're also being sanctified.
Not well. Let me speak to that. And while I appreciate that that marriage is a sanctifying relationship for us, it is one of many that God provides.
Yes.
And through the journey of life, we are sanctified in the whole collection of relationships and interactions and the family of God that God has given us. We're sanctified by our relationships, sometimes in the workplace, that teach us what we can, appropriately do and how we respond to colleagues. We are sanctified by many, many things. So I think it is very problematic to suggest that even the primary purpose of marriage is sanctification, because that would suggest that either as singles, we're perfect and we don't need to be sanctified, or that we're condemned to being never sanctified because we're not married. And of course, Jesus and Paul certainly, and let's face it, throughout the history of the church and Scripture, there are single men and women who have traveled the journey of faith and have been very, very much focused on the sanctifying journey of life. And there's so much that God shapes us in the single journey that plays a sanctifying element that I think is underappreciated so much in the sort of the typical parlance on this.
I agree. And I think that actually we're not doing married people a service when we think of it that way either, because I think marriage gets used as a shortcut to stuff we all have to do anyway. And if it doesn't serve as a good shortcut, then you bring those challenges into your marriage. And so we see a lot of people thinking that their issues with intimacy are just going to be solved through marriage, that their issues of selfishness are just going to be solved through marriage. And and then we wonder why the divorce rate is as high as it is. I think that their sanctification is a human issue. It's a Christ-following issue. It's part of the process of becoming. And yes, God might use marriage to rub off some rough edges, but he might not. And those edges still have to come off.
Barry, you mentioned Jesus and Paul, and in your article, you talk about the significance of Jesus and Paul writing and living lives of single men. Mm-hmm. Tell us why it's important that Jesus and Paul were single, and obviously Jesus, more importantly than Paul. Tell us the significance of that.
Well, I think the most vital point that I think emerges from Jesus's singleness is when we think about what is what is necessary to be fully human, what is required to be fully human. I think there is a large narrative in our world, in our secular world, particularly our secular world that has no God, that says you, to be fully human, you need to be in a conjugal relationship. And that, I would say, that goes back to Darwin, the survival of the species. It's in Freud. It's in the modern parlance of you find your identity in your sexual relationships. And I think what Jesus shows us is that what is fundamental to being human, Hebrews reminds us that Jesus was human. He was like us in every way necessary in order to be an atoning sacrifice for our sins. So what Jesus shows us is that being fully human does not require a conjugal relationship. It doesn't require marriage or physical family. And that he points us obviously to what does make us ultimately human is being created in the image of God and seeking the fulfillment of that divine human relationship that God has created us for as human beings. And that's what distinguishes us from the animals, by the way. It's not having a sexual relationship. Animals do that too. What defines us unique as human beings is being created in the image of God and being destined for relationship with Him. And Jesus models that for us.
And I think, the root of that is desire. I think that the human expression or experience of that is desire. And on this side of heaven, there will always be a certain amount of that desire that is unfulfilled. Like in Ecclesiastes, it says He's set eternity in our hearts. We are built for more than can fit into a human life. And so that longing and that desire, I think, again, the world offers sex as something to fill that desire. And I think God offers so much more. He offers Himself to fill that desire. And sure, can worship or can expression through conjugal relations be part of that? Of course, but it's a part. It's not the whole. And if we tap into the bigger picture of what it means to desire, what it means to be fulfilled, what it means to worship, I think we're having a much more wholesome conversation that includes more than just married couples or singles. It's all of us.
If we're talking about desire, I would like to talk to you about my deeply held desire to fix people up who attend our church. It never works out. And I wondered if that, as a single person in the church, I'm just guessing that happens, that you mentioned, Karissa, about singleness is not a problem to be fixed, but a life to be lived. But it's not just single people who need to believe that. It's a lot of do-gooders like me who think, well, this lovely woman must meet this great guy. Tell me about that experience, which I assume you've had attending church. Is that a good thing, or would you like us all to just stop?
I don't know. I don't know. I think it depends. I think when it's from a place of deficit, that's when it's bothersome. When it's like, oh, I'm incomplete and you need to find something to complete me, that's when it feels annoying. And that's when it's probably not going to work, because that's when it's just, here's a man. It doesn't matter if you're compatible. It doesn't matter if I think you have mutual interests. It's just a man because you're alone and you should be with a man. That, I think, is very frustrating. People being aware of other people in their circle who are might be compatible or might be interesting. I mean, especially because dating options seem to be so limited to online, that still sounds like it could work out. But again, is it from a being repaired standpoint, or is it just inviting into community? And I think the caution too is it's really easy to turn everyone of the opposite sex into a prospective partner, which just screws up friendship. It just ruins relationship when all you're looking for is a romantic output. So I don't know. I think it depends, and I wouldn't want to claim to answer on behalf of all singles, but I think if you're looking to fix us instead of fix us up, then stop.
Yeah. Can I weigh in on that, Karen?
Please.
I think, and this is from my own journey as being a singles pastor and being single myself, I think the most important advice I would give somebody who wishes well, say a married person who cares for a single in their community, is to listen. Find out. Not all singles are in the same place. You will find that some singles are absolutely, they would love your help, to be honest. There are others who say, I am in a good place. I don't, I find it insulting that you would think that there's something wrong with me. So it seems to me the assumption, the blind spot, isn't the desire to help, and that there might be some occasions where that's desirable and welcome. It's the assumption that all singles are in the same place. All singles need that completion, and so we need to help them solve the problem. And that is just not, it's not the case. And the most important thing is to get to know the person and say, hey, how are you? If I found somebody that I thought you are interested, are you interested in that? Would you, is this something that you would welcome or not? And that way you don't presume that that's the place of life that they're at. Because there are, believe it or not, a number of singles who are not looking and don't even want to be regarded as somebody that's looking and in need.
I think too, sometimes people wanting to fix someone up is about their own anxiousness, and it's like, is this like, am I enough for you as a friend that we can just be together? Like, I'm fine hanging out with couples. We're not in Downton Abbey times. We don't have to balance a dinner table. Like, is it okay if I come to the party alone, or are you awkward by that? And so I think, whose anxiety are we solving? And I've also seen many times where the fix-up isn't advantageous to me or to the person they're offering it to. It's like, oh, I have this nephew, you'd be so good for him. And it's like, well, his life is in no way together. Like, no, thank you. And so what are we trying to do with the fix up, I think, is an important question.
Yeah.
Which problem are we trying to solve?
Exactly. Right. And whose problem are
we trying to solve? Are we trying to solve? Yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Well, let's talk then about spiritual family and community. You both point to this in your pieces. I think that, we can be in community together, like Karissa, you just mentioned, the dinner party and being included and warmly embraced. Tell us about that. How can we all do that better? Just lean into that idea of complete spiritual family in a healthier way. Karissa?
I think so much of it has to do with what we celebrate. So many natural celebrations are built around a traditional family model. So you get engagement parties, you get wedding showers, you get the wedding, you get baby showers and birthdays and anniversaries and Valentine's Day. And then, in church ministry, it's all geared around kids and youth. And like, it's very family oriented. And I don't think we need to stop that. I think we need to make space for, can we celebrate when I kick butt at work or when I get a promotion? Can we celebrate when someone runs a marathon? Can we celebrate milestones and achievements in an individual life that are outside of those sort of family markers? And normalize actually like buying gifts for them. Like, think about how much money you spend on gifts for a married person throughout the course of their life. And yet there's not those same opportunities to actually give gifts or to recognize. So how can we make a bigger deal out of life moments that have nothing to do with a relationship status? I think that's a big way. How about you, Barry?
Yes. One of the things that we've done at our church is when you think about Acts, Paul and Barnabas were commissioned, right? They were, laying on of hands. We've been more intentional about commissioning some of our singles. Yes. I was commissioned for the ministry I'm on. There was laying on of hands. We're commissioning next week another single missionary in our community. We have commissioned those who are called on special assignment. I think that's it's one example of what Karissa is talking about, of how do we acknowledge and create other types of ways of celebrating each other that aren't simply marriage and family related. The other thing I would say is a lot of, often it's focus. Think about Mother's Day and Father's Day. I'm always reminding pastors that there are spiritual mothers. And the original British Mother's Day was actually Mothering Sunday, when they celebrated the mothering of the church. And I think, and now, it's become just about physical mothers having kids. That can be a very painful experience for single women and single men with Father's Day if we don't think about the spiritual mothering and fathering. So we can broaden some of these family-oriented occasions to think about spiritual family rather than just nuclear family.
I think too, like, so much about how it gets mentioned or not mentioned can have an impact. And so I think for a preacher to assume the only human experience is marriage is such a mistake. And I don't think we need necessarily all these sermon series on singleness now, although, I mean, we've had how many on marriage, it wouldn't hurt. But just for a pastor to drop in a line that acknowledges that maybe marriage isn't an inevitability. Just, it's just sort of assumed that that's where you'll end up, especially when topics such as purity or sexuality come up. It's like, oh, you save that for a future marriage. Okay, so what do I do if I never get married? Like, just not framing coupledom as an inevitability, I think could help be so much more inclusive to a broad range of experience. And I mean, I think about people who have been married and are now divorced, and every time this comes up, they feel condemnation, or who have been married and now have lost their spouse and feel grief. And so are we acknowledging that there's more states of being for an adult human than marriage?
That's right. And one other point to add to that, and I want to be careful. I don't want to be policing language, but I think we need to be sensitive to language. Let me give you a tangible example around Christmas time here, which it happens to be at this moment. We traditionally at our church would bless those in need with food hampers, and for many years the slogan was "Bless a family in need this Christmas." And I mentioned one time, I said, when we say bless a family in need, are we saying that if you're single and not in a family, that you're not in need, or just that we don't bless you? And there was just an aha moment that one little bit of communication was communicating way more than we realized as a church. And by changing the language to bless those in need this Christmas, they completely eliminated that problem and that bias. So little things like that can go a long way for how we are intentional about thinking about everybody in the body of Christ, whether they're married, single, in a family, in a blended family, in a single parent family, married without kids, right? All these different realities people have and live, as Karissa said, we need to acknowledge and give voice to.
Yeah, and I think your article very talks about this too. It makes it better news for everybody. I've written on this too. Just, the mandate of the Old Testament was be fruitful and multiply. The mandate of the New Testament is go and make disciples. And you talked about how we can all be making disciples, but that's good news for families too. Like, I think about busy moms who sit and listen to a message about discipleship and just leave with so much guilt of like, how am I going to fit discipleship into my life too? And I remember talking to my friend and I was like, you're doing it. You're raising little disciples. That message was for me. Like, that way of making disciples was for me who doesn't have kids. You're doing it. And so I think when we recognize that there's so much more experience, we can speak to that experience, and it's good news for everybody because we don't all have to do it all.
That's right.
It really strikes me the role of vulnerability here and transparency that might be required by the single person to share what their needs are, or to share what their contribution could be, and to share things like, I got a promotion at work and I want you to give me a gift.
Yeah, totally.
Or whatever these, celebratory, or the sorrow too. Like, there is such a, and this is true for all of us, whatever our marital status, but the courage it takes to be transparent and say what we need or what we want or what would help us be healthy in that moment. It is hard to do that, and to say that, well, yeah, I would love to be included in your dinner party and you don't need to fix me up with your nephew, Frank.
That's such a good point. I've had a married couple that I'm quite close to in my life for a long time, and they're always saying to me, if you ever need anything, like if I say to them I'm lonely, like, oh, if you ever need us, and then I'll invite them to something and they're like, oh, we're just gonna have a quiet night in. And I'm like, I'm never gonna say, hey guys, I'm so lonely tonight. Can I please come over? I'm gonna say, wanna come over for dinner. Like that's how it's gonna sound. And I think we have to get better at picking up those cues from each other. Again, this isn't just singles. It's like, wait a second, none of us ever really lead with our vulnerability. We lead with a bid for connection. And how can we be more sensitive to those bids for connection? I think that singles in many ways are sort of the canary in the coal mine on a huge issue in the church, which is we suck at friendship. We just suck at friendship. We're good at programs. We suck at friendship. I think singleness experienced that first and harder because we don't have a default at home. But I know tons of people in couples who also don't have a good community of friends or a solid community of friends. They've got couples that they can go to events with. They don't have friends. And so I think this call to connection and vulnerability is much wider than just singles.
It strikes me that sometimes we think of this from the position of like, oh, married couples have singles over for dinner or include single people in your family celebrations and so on. Again, it's that idea of they need our help,
Right.
or something. But we know that unmarried Christians must have lots to offer to, the more traditional family structure of a husband and wife and children. So what is the church missing out on when they don't include you, Karissa, or include you, Barry, or include me, Karen, as a newly widowed person in their daily life or their celebrations? What can we bring? What can we contribute that they wouldn't have otherwise?
Well, I will just chime in from the standpoint of my own experience I was in a cell group when I was in Cambridge for 5 years. And it's the only time, I have to say, in my life that I've been in a small community group within a church that was truly diverse. We had one married family with kids, just one. We had divorcees, we had widows, we had marrieds without kids, or empty nesters. We had one woman that was there without her husband. We had, every possible combination. And I think what we realized was what we brought to each other at the table was perspective. We bring different points of view. And what we most benefited from was hearing how somebody else could speak into that situation and how they often had creative solutions. Singles often have creative solutions that marrieds never think about, because marrieds have assumptions that the husband or the spouse will always take care of certain things, or they just make assumptions because that's how they always do things. And I think there is often blind spots that people in different living situations who have struggled past some things can often give perspectives. We also can, I believe very much in this idea of spiritual parenting others' kids. We as spiritual parents, we infect, we encourage, we help all those who are growing in the faith, right? So as we think about being family together as spiritual family, there's often many things that singles can can advise, can support, can be friends to maybe a struggling teenager who's just doesn't know how to talk to mom and dad because of their anger or frustration or their hormones or whatever. But that other person, wow, yeah, I could talk to them because they're single and they're not with mom and dad. They're a little bit like me. So I think there's many ways we can speak into each other's situations, and that gets lost often when families are either strictly involved with themselves or even when they're just with other families in exactly the same situations.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, perspective, time, restedness. I mean, I think singles are going to make a lot better decisions than a lot of young parents, let's be honest, because they're better rested. Um, yeah, a connection to maybe other things that are going on that they have more time for. Like I think about singles being able to make connections between people and issues and topics because their viewpoint can maybe be a little bit wider. It's not so honed in on just what's going on at home all the time. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think we bring a little bit of maybe a prophetic voice into some of the challenges that are facing the church because I actually think they hit us first in a lot of ways. I think about how singles could have been used during the pandemic, and I just don't think we're like, who knows how to self-soothe, manage emotions, withstand being isolated and home alone, understand how to take care and staff their life when they can't rely on people. Like those are skills that singles had going into the pandemic that a lot of married people didn't have and really suffered for. And if we'd had a better relationship or infrastructure or whatever you want to call it pre-pandemic and have been able to call in those gifts and call in those people in our lives, I think we would have been way better equipped for the isolation we faced because that's the singles bailiwick. I mean, the pandemic was hard for me too, don't get me wrong, especially living alone and not being able to go and connect the way that I usually do. But I was also way more used to it than a lot of my married friends of like, oh yeah, I deal with this a lot. And that was just such a lost opportunity to me where singles could have spoken into the body in a big way.
So, as you two, I'll ask you each to answer this as we start to close, but what would be the most important message or insight that you would want a local church to have about the full inclusion, if I can say that, of marrieds and singles? I like that we're calling them marrieds. How do we create a healthier spiritual family in our congregations? Barry, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, it's picking up on a number of things we've already mentioned, quite frankly. It is being aware, an intentional awareness of the diversity of our people, a conscious hesitancy to try to fix those that are different from us, particularly those that are single, an intentionality about listening and getting to know and learning how each person is flourishing, in what ways, and in what ways they're truly struggling, so that we can truly listen and be family to one another. So I think, and I also think churches should think about every level of their community. Are they engaging singles in their community? So that means are singles considered eligible for boards, for pastoral positions, for leadership in the church? Is our statements of doctrine, are they single inclusive? Or do we say things like, sexuality is only to be expressed between a man and a woman in marriage? well, I guess that means, the singles have no sexuality.
Right.
I mean, so things like that, an awareness, an intentional awareness and consciousness of the plurality of our people in our congregation.
Yeah. I would echo that, and I think if I have to drill down to like a fundamental thing, we gotta unhook the gospel from the American dream. Like, getting married, the white picket fence, the 2.4 kids, that's not the gospel. That's not the good news. And as long as we keep aiming at that as a church community, aiming at having everyone in these neatly packaged families, we're going to be excluding whether we want to or not. And I think we got to reorient to, oh, actually, the gospel is that we're all full humans in Christ, that we are all being sanctified, that we can all be part of a body. Like the good news is those things. And oh, marriage might happen to be part of that. I think it's less trying to find ways to include and more, as Barry said, being sensitive to ways that we're excluding. And I think we exclude when we assume that marriage is the ultimate thing, that's a symbol of the ultimate thing. It's not the ultimate thing.
Karissa and Barry, I just want to thank you so much. So helpful. And I encourage listeners to check out those articles in the November-December 2023 Faith Today, and you can read them at faithtoday.ca as well. So, yeah, thank you, Karissa, and thank you, Barry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen.